Good morning. Welcome to today's webcast on CO2 emission reductions and carbon capture. I'm Mike Rhodes, and I'm the managing editor for hydrocarbon processing, and I will be one of your moderators today. The battle to reduce carbon emissions is rapidly gaining momentum with global regulations and legislation for heavy industry. This momentum has pushed carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS, pushed these innovations into the spotlight. These CCUS technologies are already lowering cost and transforming industry. But how do you know what is the right solution for you and your industry? To help answer this question, we have Carbon Clean's Director of North America, Glenn Bailey, leading this session. He will also kick off and discuss how they are revolutionizing industrial decarbonization, and Glenn will moderate the discussion with industry and market experts. We're excited to have with us today Patricia Loria, Senior Client Engagement Lead, Americas at the Global CCS Institute, Tony Tarrant, Manager of Midstream and LNG of Wood, Marty Lael, Senior Director, Carbon Capture and Conversion at RTI, and Tim Mahoney, former Congressman and founder of Caribou LLC. If you would like to know more about our presenters today, more information is available on the registration page. Now, just some general housekeeping notes before we get started. Following the presentations, we'll have a short Q&A answer session. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Just type your question into the Q&A box located on the bottom left corner of your screen, then click the Submit button. You may enlarge the slide window at any time during the presentation by clicking on the arrows at the top right corner of the slide area. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. If you are experiencing problems with the program, please press the F5 on your keyboard to refresh the presentation. You can also visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the Help button below the slide window. Now let's get started. I'll hand it over to Glenn Bailey, Director of North America, Carbon Clean, to set the scene for the session today. Glenn?
Thanks, Mike. Welcome to everyone in this large and distinguished audience. Carbon Clean is glad to be participating in this important panel on CO2 emissions reduction and carbon capture, hosted by hydrocarbon processing. So as an outline of this session, I'll start by giving a very brief introduction of Carbon Clean. Then I'll be handing over to our panelists so that they can introduce themselves and give some background on their own activities relating to carbon capture. As Mike had mentioned, you can submit questions along the way, and we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. So just going right into the introduction. First, I want to highlight some of the key challenges that we hear from the industry and which you can expect the panel to discuss. First is the challenge around anticipating new environmental legislation. Second, the pressure on profitability continues. Third, where does the expertise come from to deploy carbon capture and storage? And finally, when can we expect broad new carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects to happen? So Carbon Clean is focused on really revolutionizing industrial carbon capture. So industrial sites, some of the challenges I'll just mention with industrial sites is that they are typically space constrained. So that's a very beginning point that's very important. So we're going to be addressing the footprint reduction. It is the cost of CO2 has historically been too high, so we have to drive that cost down. And for the get the best CO2 capture rate possible for the money, so the best return possible. Now about Carbon Clean, so we were founded in 2009. Headquarters in the UK, but we're expanding around the world. We have more than 40 installations that are using our technology. We're focused on the hard to abate industries, that is ones that CO2 emissions is actually part of the process. That could be things like cement, steel, refineries, chemical, energy from waste. Our company has developed a strong patent portfolio, these years of R&D investment, and all that time getting ready for now, really. I'll say that over the past year, our growth rate has been phenomenal. We've had it doubled in the past year, and if anything, it's increasing. So that trajectory continues. So our company has several different systems approaches for delivering carbon capture. We develop large plants that use our CDR Max technology as a basis. This enables excellent efficiency and brings environmental benefits. We offer semi-modular systems, which are shop fabricated and then transported to the customer site for less installation effort. And both of those are available now. And we're working on a technology advancement that we call Cyclone CC. This is in development, but it will enable fully modular implementations because key components are going to be made so much smaller. We're very proud of our strong global partnerships. These are some of the announced companies that have indicated they're working with us, some of our key investment partners. So there's some fantastic names up here. There will be more added, and we're very appreciative of all of our partners. So I'll just wrap up my intro section by saying, why are we well positioned for this current time? And that's because of our patented chemistry for advanced solvents. We're experienced with a wide variety of flue gases. Aiming equipment is something that engineering contractors have decades of experience with. So we enhance the performance of that process that's been so well wrung out. And then we're all about driving down cost and footprint reduction, and there's a roadmap to really go further. So with that, we'll go to our expert panel that's going to be discussing CO2 emissions reduction and the vital role of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So first, I'd like to hand over to Patricia, Senior Client Engagement Lead at the Global CCS Institute. Patricia?
Thanks so much, Glenn, and thanks, Mike, and all the people at Hydrocarbon Processing as well for inviting us to talk about this important topic. Just a little bit about the Institute. We are a global organization whose mission is to advance the deployment of carbon capture. We're headquartered out of Melbourne, Australia. We have offices in London, Brussels, Beijing, Tokyo, and in Washington, D.C., as well as we have a person in Houston as well. We're a membership-based organization, 100 plus strong. Carbon Clean is one of our members, and we're happy to work with exciting technology companies like Carbon Clean Solution, who we think are so important to addressing the emissions from heavy industry and meeting our goals under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So first, a message I want to share with you is that carbon capture works. It's actually been in production for 50 years. The first facilities started working and using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. This is a picture from Illinois, from the Archer Daniel Midland ethanol facility that captures CCS. So while we do need to do a lot to advance this technology and increase deployment, this is a technology that is proven and works today. So right now we have 26 facilities in operation, and they're capturing 40 million tons a year of CO2 and safely and securely storing it underground. We have a pipeline around the world of 65 large-scale CCS facilities, and combined those will capture 115 million tons per annum. But according to the IEA, in order for us to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius as part of their sustainable development scenario, we need to get to 5.6 million tons per annum of CO2 captured. So a very long road ahead that needs multiple partners, multiple companies helping us to achieve these goals. So this figure shows you the different industries that make up that 5.6. So there's certainly power generation, heavy industry, fuel transportation pathways, including for the oil and gas segment, and those are all really important. This is a global picture, so certainly that's going to look different in the United States, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. When we look at some of these facilities like coal, the majority of those are looked to be in non-OECD countries, places like China and India that are an important part of the conversation that we're working with in order to advance CCS. That same IEA report, that Sustainable Development Scenario, looked at where CCUS was going to be the most important, and there are certain industries already highlighted by Glenn that really need CCUS because not only do they require on very high heat, so kind of high electricity in order to produce their products, and this is iron and steel, cement, chemicals, but also fossil fuels remain part of the feedstock. But also when we look at fuel transformation, the oil and gas industry is looking heavily at how you incorporate CCS into the refining and processing in order to decarbonize that segment. So again, there's a lot of work going on, but a lot more we need to do. So IEA also recently put out what they call their clean technology scenarios. So how do we decarbonize all the pathways across power, transportation, and industry? And what they determined is the world will need $10 trillion of investment in CCUS in order to decarbonize by 2060. And candidly, 2060 is too late. Most analysis now say we need to get there by 2050. And if you've been listening to President Biden and many of the GC nations, we're talking about decarbonizing power in developed countries by 2035. And in talking to several of our members in the utility sector, that really requires CCS because that's a proven technology. Not that we're not going to need a whole ton of renewables, and we're not going to need energy storage, and we're not going to need hydrogen, but CCUS on natural gas needs to play an important part of that conversation here in the United States, and CCUS on coal and natural gas is going to be important around the globe as we decarbonize power. Now, the financial institutions are really getting on board as well. We do have members, including HSBC and Silver Point Capital, who are focused on this, but we've also heard from 6 major financial institutions that not only have they committed to net zero in their operations, but they've committed to net zero in their financed emissions. So that's all the money that they loan to heavy industry in the oil and gas sector. So those companies are committed to making sure they're working with their customers to decarbonize or will look to divest from that. And there's a lot of conversations in the ESG community around the importance of carbon reductions in order to be kind of a good corporate citizen, and that is going to be reflected in stock prices, we believe, moving forward. As I said, another snapshot more from a U.S. base. This is some work done by Rhodium Group that looked at the opportunity to put CCS on retrofits. And they look at that in kind of the near term versus the long-term opportunities. The near term are really those facilities that have a lower cost of capture for CCS. So ethanol facilities, which have a high percentage of CO2 in their flue gas, fall into that category. And we have seen an incredible array of announcements from the ethanol industry this year in the United States about CCS. So we're really excited to see their leadership in this space. When we look at the other end of the spectrum, natural gas power plants actually emit, or the amount of CO2 in their flue gas is very small, less than 4%. And so it's much more expensive to put CCS on those facilities. So they're likely to be longer term as policy catches up. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But these opportunities represent up to a $500 billion opportunity just in the United States. And again, we need to get it done, but certainly those businesses and those companies who are first movers in CCS can make money and have a financial advantage as well. But nothing happens without policy support. Again, we'll be talking about that throughout, but we've done some analysis on those 26 facilities already in existence. And one thing they really all have in common is value on the CO2. Now, that value could have been from using it to enable enhanced oil recovery, which is many of the first kind of 20 projects or so developed in the United States. It could be as a result of a carbon tax, regulation, tax credits, et cetera. But that's going to be really important because businesses need that support in order to make these expensive investments in decarbonizing. So continued government support, which we're seeing in the Biden administration and we're really excited about, is certainly a driver for projects moving forward. And just kind of in conclusion, I do want to highlight the U.S. leadership in this space. So when we talk about those 65 commercial facilities in operation and in development, the U.S. is the clear leader in both categories, although Europe is certainly catching up with their hub and cluster model. And so that's a lot of projects kind of coming together around one shared storage site. We're seeing that in development in the United States as well. But hopefully U.S. leadership will continue, and we'll see U.S. companies demonstrating that this is a viable technology and we can use it to reduce our CO2 emissions across pathways, including industrial emissions, transportation, and power. So here's a little bit about my information. Feel free to reach out. We're always happy to help companies who are exploring CCS as part of their decarbonization strategies. And back to you, Glenn.
Fantastic. Yes. Thanks, Patricia. We had a number of questions come in, but I think we'll just hold those till the end. And so at this point, I'd like to hand over to Tony Tarrant, Manager Midstream and LNG at Wood.
Great. Thank you very much, Glenn, and good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be with you, joining you from London. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience at Wood with developing industrial clusters over the last few years in the UK and how that might be transferred as knowledge to help clusters that are forming in North America. Firstly, about the drivers of decarbonisation, and Patricia touched on some of these already. I'm sure many of you are aware of the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015, where many governments from around the world committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And now we're approaching COP26, which will be held in the UK in November of this year. And many governments are now looking to be more progressive with the targets. To be honest, the target set in 2015 wouldn't be enough to meet the target temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius, nor 2 degrees Celsius, nor even 3 degrees Celsius. So we can expect governments to push hard and push hard upon the companies in their countries. Secondly, shareholders are looking for companies to push ahead with better plans for the energy transition. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has set forth guidelines for how investments could check against climate resilience and the changes in the environment going forward. But as Patricia mentioned previously, the larger investors are one of the prime instigators of change now, where they're requiring companies they invest in to have clear plans at the corporate level and to be demonstrating that they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions year on year. We help a number of companies around the world with their decarbonisation plans, but I think when you talk about reducing your impact, you should start at home, set your house straight first. So Wood, as an organisation, we have about 50,000 employees working in 60 countries around the world on various construction projects and designing many new developments. We have 9 sustainability goals that our executive leadership set in 2020. These talk about a range of things from ethical supply chains to diversity inclusion at all levels in the organisation, but also importantly, mentioning greenhouse gas emissions. We have made a commitment to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, and that's based on the 2019 baseline. But we think we can do that. That has a good impact, and it's right to do that. But we feel that not just using our footprint, but we can help others by affecting what we call our handprint, how we help other people. This diagram on the left here is taken from the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BEIS. I guess the equivalent in the US would be the Department of Energy. But it flags some of the carbon emissions from industrialized areas in parts of the UK, and the figures given for CO2 emissions are based on just industrial emissions and don't include power, they don't include domestic use. You see that there are 6 main clusters that have been forming in the UK over the last 4 or 5 years. And we're proud to have worked with 3 of those in the last 3 years as well. If you start in Scotland in the north, around the Grangemouth refinery, and then heading up the northeast coast of Scotland to Peterhead and St Fergus, we call that the Northeast Industrial Cluster. We've been working with a group called Nexus, and also with the main gas supplier within Scotland, to look at a decarbonisation of the gas network so that domestic, industrial and commercial supplies can be transitioned from natural gas now through to blue and green hydrogen supplies over the period to 2045 and onwards to 2100. There's also there the logo for Acorn. Acorn is a carbon capture and storage project that's based around St Fergus and storing CO2 in the North Sea, and well, hopefully from about 2025 onwards. And we're proud to be engineering as part of the FEED contract for the carbon capture plant at Acorn. That's actually working with Carbon Clean. In northeast England, there's the Teesside area, and we've worked with the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, and lastly with BP on the Net Zero Teesside project. That was looking at a new gas-fired power plant with carbon capture, but also some other industrial facilities in the Teesside area, including fertilizers, petrochemical facilities, and hydrogen plants, with a common network for gathering the CO2, for booster compression, and common storage facilities. And then further down the coast, in the Humber area, we've been working with a group called Humber Zero, looking at decarbonisation of a cluster of 2 oil refineries with a combined heat and power plant that supplies steam and electricity to the 2 of them. And we've looked at how they can work together using post-combustion carbon capture, blue and green hydrogen to reduce their carbon emissions. And we've recently started working in the FEED phase with those partners. So we've seen how industrial clusters form in the UK. I was excited to see recently ExxonMobil's announcement that they're looking to build a huge cluster around Houston, looking to capture and sequester up to 100 million tonnes per annum of CO2. And that's fantastic news. But what can clusters forming in the North American continent learn from what we've been doing in Europe? I thought of 6 main points I'd like to share with you. Firstly, I believe working together create new opportunities. And if you think about the Humber Zero grouping there, we have 3 different sites. We found opportunities, for example, where blue hydrogen could be created on one site. It could be transferred across to one of the refining sites that has various fired heaters spread out around the site and used instead of refinery fuel gas to fire those heaters. That reduces emissions there, but it does produce the problem of there being refinery off gas that needs a home. Well, we take that across the boundary to the 3rd site, and there it can be used in auxiliary boilers where there's post-combustion carbon capture. So working together creates all sorts of opportunities that didn't exist in the first place. I didn't see anything in the ExxonMobil announcement about how they were going to work with other parties in that area. And it'd be great to hear how that's going to work, because I think that's of benefit to everyone. Secondly, sharing infrastructure spreads the risk. Some of the early plans for carbon capture in the UK involved a single point source of CO2, a single pipeline operator, and a single storage operator. And that they fell by the wayside because those three elements all working together or working against each other created too much risk. So the latest clusters have multiple inlet feeds of CO2, and they share perhaps a couple of pipeline routes and different storage locations. So it spreads the risk to make sure that there's not too high a risk for any individual party. My third point is around stakeholder relations. They are critical, not just with the national and state government and the regulators, but also local authorities and local communities. These are the communities that have supported these industrial bases for the last decades, and they're keen to see new growth, new jobs for their communities. But they're a little nervous about what CCS means for them. So it means working with them to help them understand. In terms of costs, we believe a lot can be learned from past projects. It's great to see that from the Boundary Dam experience, the International CCS Knowledge Centre got set up to share knowledge with people. And the UK government's very keen that lessons learned on cost on UK projects can be shared across the country and globally. And Wood has been learning lessons about things such as modularization and about how dispatchable power plants work with CCS that we can share with our new customers. And we like to think global, act local. That means we have a global technical expert network that feed into local engineering centres and provide the expertise from our past projects into projects at key design periods. My final point is around the race to decarbonise. It's not a term I actually like, because to me, the race to decarbonise sounds like a marathon race being run, where somebody wins, gets all the glory, whilst everybody else is lying tired out at the wayside. I think of it more like a scout troop going on a big exhibition together. They know where they're starting from, they know where they want to get to, but they don't know the path. They have to work together to work out what the path is, and then when they all get to the end point, they're all winners. So thank you very much for listening. I'd like to hand back to Glenn.
All right, super, Tony. That was a good analogy there at the end, and we've got a lot of questions that came in, which we will bring back in later. Now I'd like to hand over to Marty Lale, Senior Director, Carbon Capture and Conversion at RTI.
Thanks, Glenn, and definitely well said, Tony. Just wanted to give everyone a little bit of perspective about who we are at RTI International. Some of you probably never heard of us before, but RTI, we're an independent nonprofit institute with headquarters in RTP, North Carolina. So we provide research, development, and technical services to government and commercial clients worldwide. We have a mission, which is to improve the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. And we have, over the years, worked on advancements in the technology space for carbon capture. And those advancements have been focused on water lean and non-aqueous CO2 solvents. We've been working on that for about 11 years. And along the way, we have had the pleasure of partnering with the numerous entities. Some of those are shown here on the screen. Our biggest supporter over the years has been the Department of Energy through NETL, as well as the Department of Energy through their EERE agency. And we are working with at Technology Center Mongstad in Norway. So we are not just domestic, but work internationally outside of the U.S. and working with Technology Center Mongstad for a large demonstration that I will tell you about in just a few minutes. We're also working with industry partners such as CMEX and Carbon Clean in various projects that I will highlight more in the presentation. So the core of the advancements that we've made in carbon capture in the last 11 years have been by focusing on reduction of the parasitic energy penalty associated with the carbon capture process. Many of you may know this, but some may not on the call here. But the process involves one side of the process absorbs CO2 from the process gas that's being treated, and the other side regenerates that rich, cycles it back to the absorber for more CO2 removal. So the costs associated with a process like that were categorized around 2009 by Gary Rochelle from University of Texas, and he showed that at that time the parasitic energy penalty was the greatest contributor to what was estimated to be increased in cost of electricity and the cost of CO2 avoided. So in the last decade, we focused on reducing what's known as the reboiler duty. And the reboiler duty is important because it cuts the amount of steam that you have to take from the power plant to run your carbon capture system. Also, of course, another way to lower the cost and keep the cost of electricity low once you add carbon capture units to the process is to reduce the capital expenditure associated with the carbon capture plant. And that if you combine those two with also limiting the operating cost, then we're able to drive the cost of CO2 capture down. So what I've shown here in this slide is just the expression that's used in for the heat associated with the reboiler duty in the process. It has three terms: the sensible heat turn, heat of vaporization, and heat of absorption. And we started working on this about 10 years ago. The state-of-the-art, there was a state-of-the-art solvent that is still a good performing solvent. It's known in the industry as 30% aqueous MEA. And reboiler heat duty variables, which are physical and thermodynamic properties of the solvent, which if you change the values of those variables in the right direction, you can arrive at a solvent that has the potential to perform for just a fraction of the reboiler heat duty compared to where we started 10 years ago. And for our non-aqueous solvent technology, basically we figured out a way where the heat of vaporization of water becomes negligible to the heat duty. And our sensible heat is also decreased a good bit. So these two contributions lead us to being able to reduce the reboiler duty and drive down the cost of carbon capture substantially. We have over the years demonstrated this technology at various stages of larger and larger scale. We started by discovering the chemistries that do that here at RTI in the first 2 to 3 years of development, and then we began to demonstrate it at capture plants, demonstration facilities around the world. This one I'm showing here is part of the CO2 lab that is in Norway, and this is operated by Syntef, where they've built a state-of-the-art demonstration facility that utilizes about 700 liters of solvent to circulate in this 10-story demo unit. And in using this demonstration unit, we're able to take a look at the emissions that can be generated by the technology, the degradation that occurs in the solvent due to some of the unwanted contaminants in the flue gas that degrade the solvent. And then we're able to operate here for extended periods of time to demonstrate the long-term performance of the technology. And what we did implement in this at this scale of demonstration, this is approximately a 60 kilowatt unit in terms of the size of the unit being demonstrated. We implemented process changes like regenerator interstage heaters and absorber interstage coolers, which need to be added to the process for these advanced solvents to perform at their optimum. We've also we currently are working on a project where we've taken then that successful technology. It was successful at the stage that I just previously showed you in the last slide, and we are demonstrating that project at a much larger scale. This is being demonstrated at the Technology Center Mongstad facility in Norway. It's a 12 megawatt demonstration, and this is a project that's jointly funded by DOE, Technology Center Mongstad, and working with our partners Syntef, EPRI, and CCS Institute. In this project, we will demonstrate at a much engineering scale that the reboiler duty that we've observed in the past that is substantially lower than the competitive solvent technologies can be observed at this scale. We'll tabs on solvent degradation and the impacts of corrosion on the plants, which is much improved with the non-aqueous solvent and water-lean solvent technologies in terms of where we've been over the last. And then the specific challenges that we're looking at here in this demonstration is just operating the TCM plant with the new solvent technology. What are the emissions that can occur from the plant with these non-aqueous solvent technologies, and do the plant modifications that are being installed, do they successfully minimize the rise in the absorber temperature and optimize the performance of the new technology so that we observe these low parasitic energy penalties. And finally, my last slide, I just wanted to show that we have recently been awarded additional funding from Department of Energy. This from the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Agency, where we are partnering with Carbon Clean, Oak Ridge National Lab, and CMEX to demonstrate this technology for industry on a 10-ton per day capture plant in Victorville, California. So with that, Glenn, I think I will turn it back over to you for the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Marty. That's excellent. Now I would like to introduce Tim Mahoney, former congressman and founder of Caribou LLC.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I want to thank Hydrocarbon Processing and Carbon Clean for sponsoring this webinar and for all of you who are attending. As a former member of Congress and serial entrepreneur, I want to talk to you today about change, the realities of climate change on public policy, and how it will affect all of us and our respective businesses. If you look at the chart on the right, you'll see a slide from Pew Research, or a chart from Pew Research, and you'll see polling that shows that the Americans' public view with respect to climate change over the past decade. And as you can see, in 2020, not only do the majority of Americans believe in climate change, more than half believe that government has to act, which leads to my first quote. Leadership involves finding a parade and getting in front of it. Well, in this case, President Biden clearly has become the grand marshal of the climate parade. He has made it the centerpiece of his candidacy and now his presidency, which leads to the second quote: failure is not fatal, but failure to change might be. In politics, as well as business, when major changes occur, the casualties of change are those politicians and enterprises who fail to recognize it and meet the challenge. The good news is for you here today, if you at least see the danger. However, I'm sure there are more than a few here who are still trying to sound the alarms within your organizations and with your clients. Finally, the third quote: the task of a leader is to get his people from where they are to where they have not been. It's the challenge to those of us who have joined this webinar today, providing the leadership in your companies and in some cases your customers to transition to this new climate change reality. So for the doubters, here are just a few recent clippings that show how customers, shareholders, and investors are demanding corporations embrace change. And the million-dollar question is, will corporations choose climate transformation or stick with climate status quo? When you look at the history of climate change in America, I was shocked to find out that the original alarm was pulled in 1957 by Dr. Edward Teller. Teller was a member of the Manhattan Project and considered to be the father of nuclear power, who, in his testimony to Congress in 1957, said CO2 would cause polar ice caps to melt. And hence, we need to build more nuclear power plants. And, who says scientists aren't salespeople? As you can see, it took a while for climate change to catch on in Washington. But it's interesting to note that in the early years, it was mostly Republicans leading the charge, with President Obama and Democrats finally taking a leadership role with the 2007 Energy Independence Act. In 2019, after Democrats took control of the House, Speaker Pelosi put together a select committee under Congresswoman Kathy Castor to look at climate change as a national emergency and to determine what government policies need to be instituted to combat it. And as importantly, how Washington needs to be reorganized so it can make the changes that are necessary to achieve net zero climate objectives. Biden's embrace of the climate issue was essential for him to win the Democratic Party's nomination. But politically, Biden has gone one step further when he, as the moderate establishment candidate, linked climate change to global competitiveness, and then, most importantly, to new jobs. And now as president, he seals the deal with his version of President Kennedy's Man on the Moon by the end of the decade challenge, when he commits by 2030 to cut CO2 emissions by 50%. He's doubling down on Obama's commitment to CO2 reduction when he signed the Paris Climate Accords back in 2015. That's a huge deal, especially when you consider the fact that the U.S. has been missing in action during the Trump administration. Biden, like Kennedy, on the day that he set the goal, didn't have either the money or the technology to achieve it. Like Kennedy, Biden is betting on companies like Carbon Clean and folks like yourselves to innovate our way to success. So today, we find ourselves with the Biden administration putting America on a wartime footing to achieve net zero. He is committed to take climate from a political nod to the central organizing principle for the federal government. Think about it. Today, it takes 13 agencies to produce the National Climate Assessment. The blueprint is Kathy Castor's plan from the House Select Committee. Biden has set the goal and has retaken global leadership for the Paris Accord. He has promised the biggest investment in the history of the federal government to develop the technologies, to educate the workforce and to fund the transition of the American economy to achieve net zero by 2050. Now, as you look to develop the decarbonization solutions for your businesses, know that Uncle Sam is willing to be your partner by making the and universities, funding research and development with industry, and putting money for demonstration projects. A great example is the public-private partnerships we just heard about, where DOE is funding the development of a solution in the cement industry, a partnership between the Department of Energy, RTI, Carbon Clean, and CEMEX. And finally, and as importantly, providing the capital to finance the acquisition of these new technologies for consumers and industry through grants, low-cost guaranteed loans, and tax incentives. DOE is leading the way, but other agencies will have their own mission-specific programs as well. So in summary, net zero is reality because the public demands it. Government will impose it, and as a result, we will all have to embrace it. The opportunity is to seize the moment by taking leadership within your companies, by becoming the change agents with your clients. My message is simple: be the change. Don't look for the perfect, find the short-term wins. Look for innovative companies like Carbon Clean that have technologies that can be deployed today. Finally, know that when you go down that path, Uncle Sam will have your back by providing access to technology, know-how, funding, and financing to support your success. I started my talk today with some quotes, and I'd like to end with one. Change will not come if we wait for some other person or time. Thank you. Glenn, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you all panelists. We're now going to move to the question and answer session. You all in the audience can continue to submit your questions in the bottom of your screen. So I'll just kind of go in the order of the speakers. First question for Patricia. What role do you see for carbon capture in the future of overall emission reductions, please?
So I think there's a lot of studies that have looked at that. So one of the studies I shared was IEA's, and so that does depend on what the industry is. For those heavy industries like cement and iron and steel, CCS is going to be really important. It could be over 50% of their total emissions reductions. I think that IEA has estimated that overall CCUS will probably be about 15% of our kind of total across different economies, across different sectors, part of the clean energy solution or the net zero solution.
Okay, that's absolutely helpful. Next question for Tony, and you mentioned this a little bit, but there's a question that came in that says, okay, so you all are active in Europe and in the UK and globally and in the US. A lot of our audience is here in North America today. So what do you see as the main differences and challenges between what you're doing in the UK, let's say, and where things are with decarbonization in the US?
Okay, thank you, Glenn. Good question. I think then if I look at two elements of that, firstly, what's the US got in its favor and what's the US got against it? Firstly, in its favor, there's a huge amount of previous investment. You've been using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery over decades, and that infrastructure's there. People understand CO2 transportation and use. It's less of a fear factor, and there's great amount of infrastructure. You've also got industrial areas where clustering is perfect. If you look around the Gulf of Mexico, there are the exhausted oil and gas reservoirs, which are perfect places to store the CO2. So that's all in your favor. I'd say the big risk is around politics. And in the UK, 2019, we had an election. Every single one of the major parties committed in their manifestos to net zero by 2050. There was complete alignment across the spectrum. And that when there's that certainty that a policy put forward now will stay in place in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years time, that gives investors certainty. And my fear is around whether state governments and national governments could flip-flop again.
Okay, so I'm going to boomerang that over to Tim then. What can you say about, is it safe to say that the U.S. government will expand incentives for emissions reduction very soon and broadly, and will they stick? I added that last part based on Tony's comment.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the message is that the people in the United States have bought into CO2. We've seen state government and local government looking at having to build seawalls to protect from intrusion of seawater into their cities like Miami. And so what you will see is a carrot and stick approach, right? So right now the Biden administration is creating the carrots, they're getting the budgets, they're making carbon and carbon capture and decarbonization a key part of every piece of legislation that they're looking at. But eventually, we're going to probably end up having to take a look at having to price carbon and have to implement some kind of cap and trade. And, it's a process that is probably going to happen and play out in the next 4 years. And it's a process that the Biden administration could do very quickly under reconciliation.
Okay. So I'm going to move over to Marty, please. And a question came in that says, from your view, is the industry at a place where it's shifting from technology development to deployment? And tell us about your view, please.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I do think that industry is shifting, from development to deployment, and I think we could give examples of just the number of large-scale project demonstrations that are emerging in the various funding agency profiles. Patricia presented a lot of those earlier, so I think we know about those, but. I would say that for me, the more impressionable indicators as of late just have been the proactive engagements, which are coming from industry to developers, and by that I mean that developers have been working on carbon capture for 10 to 20 years, but the interest and the number of approaches that you might get in the past really a lot lower than the approaches that we are getting now. My approaches, I just mean outreaches from industry in terms of companies who are interested in all aspects of carbon capture, both implementation of plants on their facilities, as well as what roles they could play in things like supply chain of the chemicals needed to use in capture solvents, or in makeup components for a system, or even for, let's say, degradation inhibitors that are needed in system to prevent oxidative degradation. So those type of outreaches are higher than ever before, and I think that's that's sort of the most impressionable one on me at the moment to say that we are, shifting from development to deployment, and should see some significant deployment very soon.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to go back to Patricia, please. And it is asking, what are business opportunities in CCUS that seem to be attracting the most interest right now?
So I talked a little bit about, that curve of industries that are kind of what we consider the low-hanging fruit. So places like ethanol that have a very low cost of capture because the concentration of CO2 is so high. So certainly looking at those are probably going to be the most profitable given current tax incentives. But there's a lot that's going into that. So we're seeing the building up of shared storage sites that then can support other industries moving more quickly towards that. And we heard a little bit about that kind of hub and cluster approach that we're seeing more in Europe, but it's taking off in the United States. We're going to need pipelines being developed. So there was a big announcement with Navigator Energy this past year where they were looking at building a pipeline to support Valero's ethanol kind of facilities, but opened it up to kind of an open bid. And what we've heard from them has been significant interest in kind of buying into that pipeline. So, you know, this really uses skills across the spectrum. It uses subsurface geological skills. It uses kind of pipeline development. It uses new technologies. So, you know, I think the business opportunities are really broad. And I think what we're also seeing is beyond the traditional states. So certainly, you know, Louisiana has one of the highest emissions per capita because of their kind of belt of industrial emissions. But we've seen states like New York, particularly looking at the CCU application. California has had a process with this low carbon fuel standard for several years now, looking to use CCUS to lower its transportation emissions. So I wouldn't say this is a one state, one industry issue. We're really seeing kind of broad interest all around the United States. And certainly Canada's doing some great things as well, and across industry.
Thank you very much, Patricia. One more question here. We have about 1 minute. This is going to be for Tony. And the question says, what are the benefits of being an early adopter on carbon capture and storage projects?
Very good. Okay. I think we talked earlier about how investors are wanting to see companies' corporate plans, how they want to see progressive nature, how they want to see being at the forefront of the energy transition. I think being one of the early investors, early adopters, gives fantastic PR. No doubt there will be challenges, there will be hitches, there might be expenses, but I think in 5 years' time, if you're trying to get on the bandwagon, you might have missed the train already. If I mix my metaphors, I think if you get in early, then you're seen as a leader and a company to invest in.
Perfect. So we ran out of time here, so I'm going to say that concludes the Q&A segment. So Mike, I'm going to hand it back over to you for your wrap up, please.
Sounds great. Thank you to our audience for attending today's webcast. Thank you to our panelists as well, Patricia Loria, Tony Tarrant, Marty Lale, Tim Mahoney, and a special thank you to Glenn Bailey and Carbon Clean for this important and engaging presentation. Finally, an on-demand version of this webcast will be made available in the coming days and will be emailed to everyone. Once again, thank you to our audience, thank you to our panelists, thank you to Glenn and Carbon Clean, and we hope you have a great day.